Hi, welcome to the next installment. Today we're talking about progressivism and the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, both progressives in their own way. Again, that we don't know how to define progressivism while we do expert management, but we don't know who the progressives were and whose interests they serve. So we classified these as the progressive presidents, even though they have differing approaches because they are presidents during what we call the progressive age. Teddy Roosevelt took over the presidency after William McKinley was shot, and he was never intended to be president by the Republican Party, which still controlled the nomination process. and he kind of is pretty headstrong, and the Republican Party wanted someone in the presidency that would just kind of do what the party wanted. And so Roosevelt uses the presidency to get his way. And this expands kind of the power of the federal government and the executive branch and begins kind of this power grab of the executive branch that culminates into 2021's super powerful president, where before Teddy Roosevelt, presidents didn't have quite as much sway, right? It was more the party who controlled the president. Now it's the president that controls the party. And we mostly thank Teddy Roosevelt for that. So let's look at Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. All right. Roosevelt first and foremost was a trust buster. Okay, so he's going to go after big business in a way that no president has done before, and he's going to do this through the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was originally passed in the late 1800s and was used against unions. Nonetheless, it's on the law. The law is on the books, and so he's going to go after that, which leads us to some of the bigger questions, right? Which is, what even is commerce? Which is the Sherman Antitrust Act makes it illegal to hinder or otherwise impede the federal government's interstate commerce regulation. Any unfair restraint of trade across state borders is under the control of the federal government. And if your trust restrains trade unfairly across borders, it's illegal. But then we have to define that, like, what is commerce? What is trade? And if you have a corporation that was incorporated in a state, is that within the bounds of the federal government, or shouldn't the state regulate that? And the Northern Securities versus United States, this is a JP Morgan Railroad Trust, basically said, yeah, the federal government does have the authority to regulate businesses incorporated in states if those corporations impede interstate commerce. And so this gives the federal government new authority to regulate trade between states. And later on, the Supreme Court will even say that even if your trade doesn't go between states, but is necessary for interstate commerce, the government can regulate you. So we're seeing the expansion of the regulatory powers of the federal government, taking that power away from states. All right. He also expanded the federal government's power in a lot of different ways. In the coal strike of 1902, he intervened in the labor dispute, and on behalf of the labor this time, for the first time, right, he basically forces arbitration and says, if you don't get this mine running, we will use the federal government and the military to run this mine because we need coal for the national economy. And so this falls under that, restraint of trade. And so instead of forcing the workers back to work, he said, we're just going to go right to arbitration. And the business owners didn't want to do that. But Teddy Roosevelt was able to use his power as president to enforce them to do that, right? So now the government's taking more of a hand in labor against big business, okay? And then he also creates two new bureaucratic departments, the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce, to regulate how we treat labor, what labor does, unions, and to regulate commerce, trade across states, right? Okay. He also passes the Hepburn Act, which strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission, which controls, further regulates railroads, right? So we're using the government as a regulatory agency against all of these things, basically trying to put the economy in the hands of the experts and not individual businesses with different motives. which is profit, right? Passes the Meat Inspection Act, largely thanks to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which features immigrant laborer who works in a meatpacking industry for a little bit in the book, and the description of what they do to the meat is bad. And he has a son named Christophorus who dies because he eats bad meat. The book is really about the struggle of immigrant labor and like how labor is mistreated, but people were just grossed out by the stories about meat, so they passed the Meat Inspection Act instead of doing anything for labor. They also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act to regulate what companies are putting in your food and drugs. So you're starting to see the elimination of some of these practices of putting, lying to people about what is in their supposedly miracle cures, right? And you can't use hard drugs in your soda anymore. Okay, and then the New Lands Reclamation Act. So they're going to take federal money and they're going to take that money and use it to improve irrigation out west, right? So again, the government, scientific management of the land, and that same thing is true of the National Parks and Forestry Service, right? He adds a bunch of national parks and then national forest, and you get that whole Teddy Roosevelt kind of thing, which happens because he didn't want to shoot a bear, supposedly, that they had lured out in front of him because it wasn't a fair hunt, right? Teddy definitely shot a lot of bears in his life. Okay. All right. So that's Teddy Roosevelt. His legacy basically being expanding the government's regulatory power and using the tool of the office of the presidency to kind of push for his vision of America against those special interests that had been controlling the levers of the state. Now, a lot of people who were controlling those levers liked what Teddy Roosevelt was doing, especially in overseas, because that benefited big business as well. But again, you have the argument that it's actually big business regulating itself and that they welcome Roosevelt's regulation and that kind of stuff because now they can regulate commerce and stop other people from coming up and competing with them, right? And it is kind of tough to make that argument. However, when you have JP Morgan himself and his Northern Securities Trust being broken up. So maybe that's some more strength for that middle class progressivism of hey, we're going to do things that benefit the middle class, like regulate their food and drugs and prevent businesses from doing that, right? But Roosevelt didn't want to stop all trust. He only wanted to stop those trusts that he thought was harmful, right? Which is a pretty big break from Taft. That's him stuck in the bathtub. Big deal, Taft. Get it? Taft was large. Did he actually get stuck in the bathtub? Probably not. Just a story some staffer wrote in a book. Can't be corroborated. But it's a lot of fun to imagine him stuck in a bathtub because he was so large. So we're going to keep going with that. Okay. Now, William Howard Taft takes over after Teddy Roosevelt decides that he doesn't want to be president anymore. He doesn't run for re-election for his second term and instead goes on a big game hunt in Africa. Because that's the kind of person that Teddy Roosevelt is. Just like, yeah, I'm president. I think I'll go hunt some lions. It's kind of crazy. Okay, anyway, so Taft comes. And Taft was the governor of the Philippines for a while, right? He's a mover. He's a large mover and shaker. We walk, everything shakes. Okay, anyway, he's a large mover and shaker in the Republican Party, right? But the Republican Party has two elements to it, and one of those is that progressive element, one is that conservative element. One's that element that likes Roosevelt and his policy, and that doesn't, and wants things to be the way they were. And so they have two views on tariffs, and Roosevelt knew this, so Roosevelt didn't do anything with tariffs, right? But that progressive element wants less tariffs. They're bad for that middle class consumer. They're bad for competition, and those conservatives want tariffs because they think they're good for big business, and we don't need to trade our goods overseas because we can just go wage war and force the people of the Philippines to trade, or Cuba, or Puerto Rico, right? Okay, so we have this element in the Republican Party, and Taft wants to address tariffs, and Roosevelt knew that. It's our Roosevelt indicator up here. Roosevelt's sad when you go after tariffs. So, and then eventually the Republicans passed the Payne-Aldrich tariff which actually ends up raising tariffs on some goods, right? Which angers the progressives, okay? Then you have the Bollinger-Pinchot affair, where Taft appoints a different person. He fires essentially Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, Pinchot, right? Who has a differing view on how to handle conservation, who believes that businesses were the best to do that because they're the most efficient way to make sure that the forests don't die, because why would they kill their own source of lumber, right? Timber. Bollinger disagrees. He wants the government to be managing those kinds of things, right? So Pinchot is mad that he's fired. He does the most mature thing. He just makes up a story of Bollinger selling land for profit, right? Which turns out to be not true. So Taft fires Pinchot for good, and again, sad Teddy Roosevelt, right? Doesn't agree with the way Taft is handling the conservation efforts, okay? All right, so Taft does do things besides make Roosevelt angry, right? He is going to start the Children's Bureau, which investigates child labor and working conditions and gets us closer to that progressive goal of public education, okay? And he is also trust buster. Way more trusts get busted under Taft than Roosevelt, probably because of Taft's size. He just stands on it. Oh, sorry, I can't resist. Okay, anyway, yeah, so he's gonna bust basically all trusts. He's just gonna be like, anything that's a trust is bad. And Roosevelt had a different approach. See, Roosevelt wanted to work with these trusts to balance out, like, okay, the government's got this goal, this is your trust goal, we're going to work with you and control it, right? Whereas Taft just says, you know, your trust is bad, we're going to break it up, right? And he busts the US Steel. As strong as US Steel is, it's a pretty good steel. That Bessemer method Carnegie Steel can't withstand the weight of William Howard Taft. I'm killing myself. Okay, so he busts up that U.S. Steel Trust, and the trust that Roosevelt had like given his stamp of approval on, right? So Roosevelt comes back from his big game hunt in Africa and sees what Taft has done to this presidency that he's given to Taft, and he's like, you know what? I don't agree with the way Taft's doing this, right? And the Republican Party likes Taft though because they can control him a little bit. And Roosevelt says, "I've hunted the biggest game in Africa, and now I'm going to hunt the biggest game on the planet, and nothing is bigger than William Howard Taft." All right. Anyway, so he's going to go after Taft. He's going to run against Taft in a race. Like, who hasn't beaten Taft in a race? It's Taft. He's slow. He's too big. All right. Anyway, so in the election of 1912, Roosevelt runs for nomination against Taft. Excuse me. But Taft is going to win the nomination because the party insiders don't like Roosevelt, right? So Taft wins, and those political machines help him do that. So Roosevelt forms his own party. It's often called the insurgency, right? He calls it the Progressive Party, but once he was giving a speech, he's like, I feel as fit as a bull moose. And so we call it the Bull Moose Party. Right? Okay. And Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson. But what happens when you have third party elections in the United States is that just splits the Republican Party, but all the Democrats vote for Wilson. So even though there were less Democrats in America than Republicans, because the Republicans are split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson is going to win the nomination. And I've drawn that little graph there for you, so that maybe that helps. Probably not. Okay. Anyway, so Wilson wins the nomination. They have two different views, you know, new freedom, new nationalism. Honestly, they're mostly similar in their way of, basically they're just going to use the government to regulate society, and just the way Wilson wants to do it is different than the way Roosevelt wants to do it, right? But the professor, Woodrow Wilson, wins the presidency. There's a lot of progressive goals, but his presidency is mostly dominated by foreign affairs and World War I and imperialism. That and his legacy there, but as well as creating that fourth branch of government, the regulatory agencies like the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk about in a later one. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the silly Taft jokes. It's a whole lot of fun.